Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Diving Deeper from Longfleet Baptist Church. My name's Ken. I'm the minister here, and this week I'm joined via Zoom by the Reverend Stephen Ashby. And Stephen is a retired Baptist minister who occasionally preaches for us at Longfleet. And I was away this weekend, and so Stephen concluded our sermon series on women in the Old Testament by giving us a sort of overview of the Book of Esther. So hi, Stephen. I hope you're all right. And perhaps you'd just like to give us a very brief sort of overview of what you spoke about on Sunday at church.
Yes, it was good to be with you again. The Book of Esther is 10 chapters, so it was trying to get. I had to more or less paint an overview because obviously the congregation wouldn't have liked to sat there listening to 10 chapters read to them.
Yeah.
But the Book of Esther is a most incredible book. Mostly because of the fact that it has all the ingredients of a modern day film. There's glamour, there is power, there's banqueting. The king has a banquet for 7 days. There's power struggles between good and bad, and in the midst of all this, there's a young girl called Esther whose unknown parents. Her parents died, and she starts from such small beginnings to become the queen of Persia, where it's set in, and King Xerxes, and yes, basically she saves the nation of Israel, who were going to be decimated because of an edict passed by the king. And it's a lovely story about the redemption of the people of God, and God working behind the scenes to protect his people, basically.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And like I said, God's not actually mentioned in it, is he, at all? So, which is quite a strange one for a Bible story. But perhaps sometimes we do feel God's not with us, but we know that he's working there in the background.
I think that's an important lesson today, especially as we live in a, we see the world on the media, we can see what's going on around the world. And sometimes when you see some of the things that happen, it raises questions about where is God in the midst of all this. And one of the things from Esther is very much the fact that behind the scenes, not even mentioned, God is working, and God is working his purposes out, although at times it doesn't always seem to make a lot of sense.
No. So you very kindly set us some questions for our weekly Bible study, and we're going to look at a few of those now. Esther is a young, powerless girl in a male-dominated society. God loves to use ordinary people in extraordinary ways. And you asked us to think of some other Bible examples of that, God using ordinary people in extraordinary ways. So what are some of the ones that you were thinking that sprung to your mind?
Yeah, like David, who became King David. He started off as a shepherd's boy, out with the sheep at night. So yes, he rose from very humble beginnings to become one of the outstanding kings of Israel. Or you could just look at Jesus' disciples. I mean, Jesus didn't go to Jerusalem and pick the brightest and the best in Jerusalem to be his followers. He didn't go those who were most educated or whatever. He just chose ordinary people, like a fisherman, like Peter, and invited him to follow him. So it's very much, especially in the New Testament, this idea that God tends to, loves to use ordinary people in extraordinary ways. And reason being probably because that way that the power of God is shown, the naturalness of faith shines through much more clearly.
Yeah. One of the examples we thought about recently in our studies was the midwives at the birth of Moses. You remember the story that the Pharaoh has commanded the midwives to kill all the Hebrew baby boys, and they won't do it, and they say, oh well, the Hebrew women labour so quickly that the babies are delivered by the time we arrive, and the very ordinary people, these very ordinary midwives, God is using to actually ensure that his people survive. But there are risks, aren't there? These ordinary people are expected to take risks for God. The disciples had to stick their head above the parapet, and the David puts himself at risk. It's not an easy thing, is it? Being an
No.
ordinary person that God has called, and you and I probably feel we're very ordinary people as well, and yet
Yeah.
God called us to church leadership, and who am I to be a minister of God? It's
Yeah.
quite challenging sometimes.
I think what people are often looking for is authenticity. And
Yeah,
I think when you get somebody who's very polished, very, very capable, and very resourceful, that doesn't always have the same authenticity as somebody who's very genuinely perhaps struggling, and yet in the midst of it all, there's a reality there. So
yeah,
I do think, I can think of a time when I had a church in the West Country, and there was a Church of England and the Baptist. And we used to go outdoor knocking, inviting people to Christmas services, Easter, that. We used to go in pairs. And I know it sounds a bit humorous, but, we used to knock on the door and they say, oh, I'm from the Church of England. So, oh, I'm from the Church of England. So if they say, oh, I'm from the chapel. And so we used to play it. So we had one from each. And I remember one lady saying she finds it very difficult knocking on people's doors.
yeah.
And yet the reality was that in that situation, when she spoke very naturally, there was a very much a genuineness about it, and it didn't come across like a cult or whatever. There was a local person doing a local thing, really.
Yeah, yeah. And we see, the Apostle Paul talks about his own struggles, doesn't he? We
Mm,
see, although Luke in Acts paints him as this very confident speaker, we see in his letters where he really wrestles with that call. He says, "I
mm,
came to you in fear and trembling. I wasn't intelligent. I wasn't articulate." So, and God uses that. And Luke tells us that Paul, this great speaker, but Paul in his heart is very anxious
mm,
about it. So ordinary people being used for extraordinary things, just having to place their trust in God.
mm,
So then you said, Esther is told to hide her faith and her nationality. And to just reading in my introduction in my study Bible, it says this is really peculiar for the Jews to
mm,
do this, especially sort of post-exile when this took place. And Esther has to plan very carefully how she speaks to the king, and she relies heavily on Mordecai, her relative. And you asked, what areas of life do you have power over others? And what situations do you feel powerless? And I immediately went to think about when I was in the army. Been in the army twice, once
mm.
as a soldier and once as a padre, and both times had authority. Although as a soldier I was only a corporal, well, that still meant I had authority over people. Corporal says to a private soldier, "Do this," and they get it done. There's no questions asked. Even as a chaplain, although I wasn't a major, I wore the rank, the equivalent rank of major. And if I wanted something to happen, it would happen. I'd go to the quartermasters and I'd say, need a table in the church. Half an hour later, a table would turn up in the church.
Yeah,
And then,
yeah.
so a real quite high level of authority for quite a significant period of my life. And then to come into a Baptist church where, as you know, the ministers, we don't actually have authority. We're working with volunteers all the time. Very different style of leadership that you have,
Mm,
I think, as a civilian Baptist minister.
mm. Yes, I think it is. I mean, especially if I used to be in the hotel trade as a chef, and in kitchens you have a very clear hierarchy.
Mm.
And as you say, anything in the volunteer sector, you're working with volunteers, so they're doing their bit out of the generosity of their own heart, etc. And so yes, it is a different dynamic. But I think we also have power in other ways. I mean, if you're a parent, you have power. If you're a young person, physically, you have power. I suppose one of the things I've noticed as one gets older and retired, and physically you can't do the things that you thought you could. There's a sense in which, as you get older, you do feel more powerless,
Yeah,
and there's
yeah.
that sort of adjustment. But sometimes it's good to think of the way that we use the power that we do have, and recognizing how vulnerable we do feel at times.
Yeah. I suppose, as we look around the world, sometimes we can feel a bit powerless, can't we? We spoke earlier about how some people avoid watching the news because it's just so depressing. And you look at Trump and Putin and North Korea and Iraq and Afghanistan and all the rest of it, and you think, oh, what possible influence can little old me have on these world events? What can
Mm.
I possibly do to have any power over what's going on? And it can be quite scary sometimes, can't it?
Mm.
Um, yeah, we see perhaps the decline of democracy in some nations that's worrying.
Mm. And diplomacy. I mean, where before the United Nations was very much seen as the flagship for, resolving disputes between nations, etc., etc., and that doesn't. It seems to have lost its voice in so many ways.
Mm.
But I think that's where Esther kind of does, behind the scenes, God was working his purposes out, and one of the things happened is that he spoke to the king Xerxes through a dream.
Yeah,
That was one of the pivotal turnings in Esther's, when she was going to share with the king what's planned to be done to the nation of Israel, the
yeah,
people of Israel. So, yes, it
yeah,
does. We only see things partially, and through media, we only see things in a way that's put across in the media that we watch. So it's very a very unusual time at the moment, really, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. And as we've said, Esther was told by Mordecai to not let on, that she was a Jew, not let on what her nationality was. And yet, Jesus said, "Don't put your lamp under a bucket.
Mm.
Don't hide your faith away." So, have you found that there've been situations where it's been wiser to be quiet and not to own up to being a Christian, or are there times when it's been important to speak up? And have you always got it right? I don't
No,
think
no,
I have.
no.
So,
Yeah, probably the same as you with the army, really, because in a busy hotel kitchen, if you say that you are a Christian, everyone knows. And so there's that sense of expectation. Yeah, so I think they're looking for consistency. Um, so you don't really have the freedom to hide from it, because if you start having double standards, I mean, they would tear you apart. They would really ridicule
yeah,
you. So there is a sense in which you need to be consistent and choose your battles.
yeah, yeah.
I remember working in one of the big hotels here in Bournemouth, and the head chef said to me, and I was at Bible college by then, and he said, "Well, how do you cope with all the language? Because all the swearing going on left, right, and centre. How do you cope with that? And I said, well, that's my background. I came to faith from that background, from a non-church background. The language, it's just life for me. And I said to him, well, you get chefs who show so much finesse in their cooking and so clumsy in their language. And I felt God was with me, giving the right words to speak up in the right way,
Yeah,
which is a truism, really, because if so that was one area. But yes, you choose your battle. Sometimes it's better to wait for another time to speak up, and other times to let it pass. And you don't always get it right, but
no,
it's not worth jumping in at every opportunity. With a certain amount of wisdom, you weigh up the situation and pray for God's spirit to kind of prompt you one way or the other, really.
yeah. I found Esther to be a really helpful book when I was a young soldier. We're talking sort of 20 odd years ago now. Um, and in fact, I felt almost like an Esther in
Mm.
some ways, thrown into a godless situation, which, as the army is, to be perfectly honest,
Yeah.
with, like I say, lots of extremely bad language, and not just bad language, but extremely bad behavior as well,
Mm.
sort of drunkenness and womanizing and
Mm.
scrapping and all the rest of it. And I'd come to faith when I was about 19 and didn't join the army as a soldier till I was 22. So I'd had sort of 3 years as a Christian and had been brought up by certainly both my grandmothers were Christians. So I had
Mm.
a lot of influence from Christianity. And I found that actually Esther just sets the example, doesn't she? She's not overt in her faith, but she sets the example of a person of faith. And that's what I found as a soldier. Actually, let people know that I was a Christian. They all knew I went to church on Sunday, on the rest of it. But I just worked hard, tried to live a good, clean life. Now that sounds like I was a sports boy, and I wasn't at all. I had fun. I did, as a young man, enjoyed myself, enjoyed my life, but actually lived clean and didn't go out getting drunk, didn't go out womanizing. And as Esther set that example, which meant that when there were situations where you needed to speak up, you kind of earned the right.
No,
And
exactly that.
you see that with Esther. She had earned the right and to speak to the king. She goes to the king absolutely panicking, and she needn't have panicked at all because he loved her and he respected her and he welcomed him into his court. And so I think that I've not found a situation where I thought I'm going to be in danger if I identify myself as a Christian. Not really. But yeah, so do we always get it right when to speak up and when to shut up? Probably not.
We don't, and we learn. I think I've probably, from looking back on the years, I've learned at one time, like praying, publicly or things like that. Sometimes you think, well, I should have done. Then the opportunity passes, and I tend to jump in now much more readily, more now than I probably used to. So I don't know. I've learned that one, but.
And I think perhaps it's probably easier for us as ministers because, someone says, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a Baptist minister. Then they expect it. But,
Yes.
I think if you're what should we say, a non-professional Christian, it can be a bit harder. And certainly I recognise that, prior to training for ministry, it was a bit harder to speak out sometimes. Whereas as a minister, people expect it. And certainly as an army chaplain, I used to walk around with crosses on my lapels and Padre splayed across my chest. And I don't tend to wear a clerical collar very often nowadays, but you see ministers that do. I walked into a hospital actually the other day, and I was wearing a clerical collar. And one of the nurses said, "Hello, Vicar. How can I help you?" So immediately they there's that expectation that you're a person of faith. I do think it's harder for the non-professional Christians, especially in workplaces and relationships and things. Good. Well, like I said, I love the Book of Esther, and I could sit here all day discussing it with you.
Yes.
I won't. But so we hope that if you've watched this little video, we hope you've enjoyed us as we've sort of raced through Esther, particularly as we've thought about these issues of power and God using powerless ordinary people and whether we should speak up and shut up. And thank you to Stephen for joining me, and perhaps we'll see you again, Stephen, on one of these.
I look forward to it.
Yeah. So I hope that God gives you the wisdom to know when to speak up, when to be quiet. Hope that he gives you the power if you're feeling powerless. And we pray that you would have the courage of Esther to do what God has called you to do in challenging situations. We'll see you again.